Hello, I'm Karen Anderson, and welcome to Ideas Live. I'm here with my co-host,
Anne-Marie Oomen.
And today we're going to talk about a topic that is really near and dear to our hearts and minds.
And minds, indeed.
And it's books, but not just any books. We decided to ask the question, what books have changed your life? And to try to talk a little bit about changed how. So we can begin just about anywhere, but when did you first start to love books?
Well, you've heard part of this story before, but I was a late reader, a troubled reader, and I found my life in books when I finally learned to read, and found that I could be totally absorbed in a story and totally leave the world and be in another world, be present in another world, and that's when I really fell in love with books. And
so about when was that?
Third grade.
Oh,
so it was late.
yeah.
It was late.
Well,
yeah.
Might not be late.
I mean, I think most of my classmates were reading in second grade, but it was a miracle. I mean, I've written about it as a miracle. It felt like a miracle to me. Like how it's a developmental process. It came together in one single day, and all of a sudden, books were going to be part of my life for the rest of my life. So.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I remember the learning to read experience, where, I mean, we were reading Dick and Jane readers then, which were
so horrible.
But we didn't know they were horrible.
That's
I mean,
true.
It wasn't about the content. It was about learning that letters plus sounds made words. And I still remember that moment when I sort of got it. And how exciting that was. And that translated into stories, which translated into that experience of being able to live more than one life, kind of. But that was a little kind of epiphany for me, just the process of getting it about reading. And, I was off and running.
Yeah. So it seems to me that we've already made a distinction that's pretty important in that we've asked the question, what books have changed us? Which, as I was thinking about this question, I'm so glad you asked it, I realized that the books that have changed us are not necessarily our favorite books.
Right. Good
I have lots of favorite books, but when it came to the books that changed me, I was looking much more deeply at the writing process, because that's how and the thinking process. What were the books that changed my thinking? And that became a really big part of it. But I think I have a narrower viewpoint because of my interest in writing. And I'd be very curious about other people who are avid readers.
Without being writers necessarily.
Right. And what books changed them and how that happened.
I started polling people just kind of informally, friends, and I was not surprised, but interested to discover that childhood books were really important to people.
Yes.
I mean, whether it was Anne of Green Gables and a good friend of mine talked about reading The Feminine Mystique, and she said, I finished that book and signed up for a master's program, and the kinds of, now there's, there's a change that you can really measure. I mean, so books can change you in different ways as
That's
well.
right. That's right. But to that end, maybe we should get one of our favorite readers,
book persons,
one of our favorite book people to come in and talk with us also, so we have more of a conversation about other influences here.
Absolutely. All right, we'll be back with our guest. Hello and welcome back to Ideas Live, and today our conversation is about books. And we welcome our guest, Bronwyn Jones, who is on the English faculty at Northwestern Michigan College, and a favorite reader of ours.
Oh, you are both so kind. I'm so happy to be here with you.
You heard us in the other room listening to the opening talk about how we first got interested in reading, Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, I'm going to echo Anne Marie in that I was a late reader. I remember being in first grade in the remedial reading group. And it was Dr. Seuss and early scholastic books. You mentioned the Dick and Jane that I puzzled through. And I have a distinct memory of sitting on the couch at home with my father trying to figure out what the word "and" meant. I mean, to show you how basic and elemental. So similar time frame, and a similar thing that I discovered the world of a book, and that your mind is just cast alight with that world.
Isn't it? Isn't it?
Fairy tales and mythology and stories about witchcraft and
I think that is something I looked for my copies of Grimm's and Andersen's fairy tales because they were the first stories I remember hearing along with the Bible stories, of course. But the Grimm's and Andersen's fairy tales were magical.
Yes.
And I think I was still at that stage where I wasn't quite sure what was real and what wasn't, you know, and so I was starting to understand that there was a reality I was going to have to live in. And weren't the fairy tales a way to go back to that place where there wasn't a set reality?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, those boundaries come down, and they were terrifying in a kind of delicious sort of way.
Right.
But I remember that sort of bleeding over into how I looked at various people.
Oh, really?
And adults, you know, wondering, were they? You know, was there an element of that until, of course, you understand that there's somewhat of a boundary between those worlds.
Was my mother the Snow Queen?
Yeah. Yeah.
Would my grandmother be at risk from wolves? Or I mean, all the, fairy tales are an important piece of that.
They were powerful, and then mythology. I mean, looking early on and sort of catapulting into wanting to read everything.
Yes.
Versions of Edith Wharton's Greek and Roman mythology.
Had that too.
Yeah.
I had that.
I remember the little drawings. I can still see
Yes.
those little pen drawings. Yeah.
And this notion that gods and goddesses were such wildly capricious people.
Yeah, how could that be?
Wasn't like that in church.
No, well,
we weren't led to believe that.
Right.
Yeah, so I had brought with me the book, one of the books, I'm not sure if it's the exact book, but Honey Bunch and Norman were...
I remember those.
This is the book in third grade. This is the series in third grade that I picked up, and finally it all came together, and I found myself reading an entire book on a lunch hour, which was unheard of, and then realizing I had read an entire book on a lunch hour, and thinking, I'm going to be a reader.
Do you remember anything about the content? I read those books, and I mean, she was awfully good.
She was too good. Now I recognize.
I mean, even the name, you know, Honey Bunch is just, but it almost doesn't matter the quality of those early readers if they get you hooked on reading, don't you think?
Right.
I mean, it doesn't have to be great literature.
I think I was attracted to her because she was so good, and I wasn't. You know, it was kind of.
You can hate people who are so good.
The appeal of the ideal.
So what about one of yours? Oh,
this is familiar.
Nancy Drew.
Yes,
oh my God.
I read all of them.
Did you?
Oh, absolutely.
Did you read all of them? Wasn't she like the best heroine to have? You know?
Yeah, pretty modern, like you know, comparatively.
Yes, the early ones particularly. I've looked at some of the later ones, you know, because now it's a what do they call it, syndicated sort of, and they're much more homogeneous.
Oh, are they? I haven't read the new ones.
I mean, I just thought she was the coolest thing. You know, this is going to sound terrible, but no mother, a sort of semi-absent professional father, and a car.
And a roadster.
I remember the cars.
And a boyfriend who wasn't all that key. I mean, she was so much smarter and more daring than he was.
It was she and her chums.
She was very, very central, and I loved that there were many of them.
Yes.
So that I could resubmerge numerous times.
Oh, and I mean, they are formulaic, but they have been around. This one, of course, this was old, but it's copyrighted 1937. So
I'm so glad you brought that.
I am as well.
And so that's always the childhood books. Dr. Seuss, I remember, was the first one who kind of taught me about sound.
Yes, the alliteration and the music of language.
And the humor.
And the humor.
I was not all that interested in nursery rhymes, but Dr. Seuss was so
inventive, really.
Yeah, there was so much more play.
Yes,
in
absolutely. And I remember growing up in my household listening to recordings of Dylan Thomas reading A Child's Christmas in Wales.
Yes.
My sort of part of my heritage. It's a small part of the heritage, but that lyric
is Welsh.
Is Welsh, and hearing that voice, and in fact, as soon as I could, I read Dylan Thomas's collected poems, and fell in love with the richness of the language, and of course the intonation of his voice. And so
it's a really different, unusual voice.
It is
it's kind
unusual.
of mesmerizing.
It has a kind of mesmerizing quality. But when you mentioned some of these early books, one that really stood out for me in terms of being life-changing was Anne Frank, Diary of a Young Girl.
Yes.
Oh, sure.
Which I read about when I was 10 years old.
Ooh, that's
And
young.
my heritage is, my mother's Jewish and my father was partly Welsh. Wow. And so while I was not schooled in either in terms of faith practice, Anne Frank's diary was so powerful in terms of getting inside the mind of a young girl, but also understanding. It was my first kind of intimate understanding of the Holocaust and
That's
the
really
toll
young to take
that took and followed. Yeah,
That's so important, and to just have that sense of history breathing on you, in a real way for the first time. Yeah, that's big.
It is big, and it was followed. I was 11. We went. My mother took my brother and I to London, and we wound up in Amsterdam. It was my first time in a country where people did not speak English, and we visited Anne Frank's house.
Oh, wow.
And so that combination of experiences was so powerful. She was a writer. She was a reflector and a writer. And so that sense of journaling, and I think that's where my own journaling really
So that was how the change. If we can identify
so
how
interesting.
things changed us, like some books just kindled our love of reading, but that's, that changed you in a way in terms of actually behaviors, so that you began keeping your own journal. I think, what are some other books that changed how we live or how, how we became who we are? I want to mention, and this is not childhood at all, but Lauren Isley, this scientist, and my high school teacher, 11th grade,
Show that to
The Immense Journey, mentioned that book, and I don't think I read it immediately, but when I did, not only did it open up my understanding of evolution, but in a personal way, he writes his essays as extended metaphors. And so he'll write very specifically about a spider, for example, attaching a web to a street lamp because the sun is gone, it's winter. And then at the end he draws these wonderful pieces of wisdom and observation out of that metaphor. And I think the idea of extended metaphor was really part of what shaped my essays and still does. So not only did he open my mind to content, but to method as well.
And while you were reading Lauren Isley, I was reading The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I know. I was in, both of you know this, I was in a convent, the Dominican convent, Marywood Academy in Grand Rapids for my freshman year of high school. But it was also the year when Man from U.N.C.L.E. was this big thing happening, and I discovered that there were these little paperbacks. This is the only one that I have. But as a result of this great adventure between Uncle, the good guys, and Thrush, the bad, can you imagine? Thrush, the bad guys, I began to write fan fiction, little stories in which I was playing a part with these two heroes. And that was the beginning of my actual prose writing. So these books, I mean, I sometimes read them in an hour or two, and then put them away, and then I'd start scribbling.
Wonderful.
So in that way, they certainly nurtured my imagination. There is nothing of literary value, no great metaphor. It's just, it was just that this changed the way. I mean, it was so powerful for me that I could enter into a story with these guys.
Well,
you
and
know?
there was tremendous narrative drive.
That's right.
That should
That's
not
right.
be underestimated. You know, the power of a driving narrative and story to captivate, you know, your mind, and both as a writer and as a reader.
So when did you first encounter that narrative drive? In what books do you think?
Well, I have some on my list. I'm gonna go to one that I read in my teen years. It was both narrative drive, but it was also kind of an altered vision of the world around me, and kind of birthed this sort of sense of awareness of the environment, which we tend to talk about as something separate than us. And this was a book that was published in 1949 by George R. Stewart, called Earth Abides. And it not so much science fiction, we might call it speculative fiction now, but the central character he's hiking in a remote part of Arizona, and he experiences a snake bite. And I mean, this is a familiar trope now, that there's a vast virus that really kills off most human beings. And he escapes it. It turns out the venom from the snake bite provides a certain measure of immunity, and he emerges from this. And it really is this vivid distinction, a description really, about how, as people go away, how things wink off. You know, electricity finally dies down, and how the natural world, trees and weeds and animals begin to reclaim.
So is he the only remaining human?
He finds others.
Okay.
And it's really a story about how people reform kind of their culture, and
Pretty timely when you think about it.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it was written in 1949, and it made such a powerful impression on me. He makes one of the last cross-country trips he can, and I was, you know, living in New York City, and he makes it to New York and describes New York without people.
Wow.
But the sense, it's not without hope. It's not apocalyptic. It is and it isn't. But that sense of the resurgence of the green in the wild.
Is it still in print? I'm going to have to write that down.
It may be. It may be. It's a powerful read.
It's one of those that if it's not in print, we ought to reclaim it.
That's
you know?
right.
We ought to,
I think it was reissued not that long ago, and I didn't jot down the latest printing, but a very compelling read. And narrative drive.
What about narrative drive for you? Because these are essays.
These are essays, and this is a personal journey. But here's one of my all-time favorite novels, "Angle of Repose" by Wallace Stegner, who is just unfortunately died too young, in his 80s, in a car accident. But this book I read as part of a college assignment, but it is so masterful, just the writing itself. But the story is just gripping. The narrator tells the story of his grandmother, who helped settle the West with her engineer husband in the 1870s. But the narrator is living in the 1970s, excuse me, with all the changes that were going on at that time in our country, and really questioning those changes and looking at a more realistic view of history. And I still pick it up, and I picked it up for the purposes of this conversation, started reading it again, and I get hooked every time.
That's wonderful.
Because I already know everything that's going to happen, but the quality of the writing and he makes observations about life and about marriage, and one of the observations that fit for me about the woman, the grandmother, who is the main character in the story, is that he says, exposure followed by sanctuary became the pattern of her life.
Oh, wow.
And for someone like me who's kind of an introvert, but who does extroverted things like television, that really spoke to me, that you can deal with exposure, but it needs to be followed by sanctuary. But you know, those kinds of insights that come out of books that can really shape you or affirm you.
Yes, yes, very, very powerful and wonderful.
Yeah. So I think I found the combination that you're talking about with Steinbeck. And even though there's so much about, you know, negativity about the man himself, the writing was incredible. First of all, it was very earth-based.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
and what you said earlier about learning metaphor, this is where I learned metaphor. You know, the whole idea of the pearl meaning all these different things, and that there could be a story in which a thing tracked through everything, driven that they needed to find the pearl, then they found the pearl, then they needed to get rid of the pearl, then the way they got rid of the pearl would affect their whole lives. That narrative drive was there, but the pearl became so many different things. And then the writing was really profoundly good. To move from this to this was a big step.
And to,
in the right
to
direction.
discover what good writing looks like and sounds like is pretty big.
It's huge.
Yeah,
It's
and to
huge.
discover that it's not just about a page turner. That there's what the language does to your heart is, I think you used the word about illuminated imagination. That is sort of the illuminated page too.
So what else is on your list, Bronwyn?
Well, there's so many different ways to think about this. And when I was thinking about books that have changed your life, I was thinking the change in perception in the ways that new possibilities, or I don't like the word paradigm, but a new shift in terms of how you see the world. And it's so interesting that much of this comes back. Reading Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale for the first time was a very powerful experience, that this was possible. And I've continued to read her more recently, the Mad Adam trilogy, which is speculative fiction, I think, at its best, where she says she takes all these different elements that exist somewhere in the world and combines them with a kind of nightmarish, creative, brilliant ingenuity that gets under your skin and your psyche. But in the literary vein, I remember Jane Eyre, reading Jane Eyre for the first
I almost
time.
picked that.
And even George Eliot's Middlemarch.
Yes.
That was this there was narrative drive, though now I read George Eliot and the sentences are so long, and we are in a more streamlined, our plastic brains are more streamlined. But those books led me to my first awareness of the feminist kind of approach to literary criticism, and that was Gilbert and Gubar's book, The Mad Woman in the Attic. That built on, and its subtitle was looking at the 19th century literary imagination and what that meant for women. If you took that notion of anxiety of influence, how was Milton, impacting the psyches of women? And so that sense, that was again a whole world that kind of opened up. And I think of it, the Mad Woman in the Attic, of course, being Bertha, the first wife, locked up kind of horrificaely, though I was rooting for Jane all the way.
Of course.
Me too.
And then I, read Jean Rhys and Wide Sargasso Sea, which flips that perspective.
And explores, just for our listeners, explores the same story from the point of view of the Mad Woman. And all of a sudden the story breaks open, that whole Jane Eyre mystique, and Jane Eyre starts to look like Honey Bunch,
But still, in Jane Eyre,
I still love Jane Eyre.
It was kind of, the paradigm shift in that was that a plain woman, a plain young girl, not a beautiful, glamorous heroine, could triumph from her own integrity and her own refusal to compromise who she was. That was kind of a new notion. When I read it, I remember going, oh, wow.
Yeah, absolutely. She was not going to follow the typical sort of romantic kind of fiction.
And I think that's also this whole idea of a this is going to sound, it is romantic, the idea of a truer love than a convenient love. You know, the choice that she makes at the end when she's all alone and has the chance to do the mission work and all of that. That's a far cry from you know, the plain romance, I guess.
Yeah.
I want to say one other thing about it. The third book I brought, just in terms of changing your life in a specific way, this is Peter Matheson's book, The Snow Leopard. And I had taken an interest in Buddhism a little bit quite a while ago and read this book, which is just a wonderful adventure about his trips to the Himalayas, but also an evocation of Buddhism as it is lived within that culture.
Beautiful.
But then I happened to be at Helen Milliken's house just doing some letter writing stuff, political, and saw a book on her coffee table about the Himalayas. And I said, "Oh, have you been there?" And she said, "No, but I've always wanted to go." And I said, "Did you read Snow Leopard?" "No." So I bought a copy and sent it to her. And 6 months later, she called me and said, "I'm going on a trip with 6 women to the Himalayas. Would you like to join us?"
Oh, my.
And so really this book is the reason I took that trip, which was quite life-changing for me in terms of
Powerful.
an adventure. And so I think that's another way books can shape us. They can kind of suggest adventures maybe that we haven't considered and that can be life-changing.
And that also make connections.
Yeah,
I mean, the
right.
connections to other people
Yes.
in that shared experience.
I tend to be really evangelical about books that I love. If you haven't read it, and I think you should,
Yes.
I just might buy you a copy. No obligation.
Oh, but I love that. I mean, the power
I think
of
we should do that more. And,
recommendation.
you know, just recently I was reading some of my mother's letters, and they're full of books, not necessarily high literary quality, but they didn't have this constant barrage of the screen, which we're fortunate enough to live with, but they had books, and they used them all the time. I mean, they were their diversion, and they were entertainment, and they talked about them, and they wrote letters about them. I just finished.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an amazing story about ending up in the Himalayas.
Do you think, I mean, you are in touch with college students today, that books are continuing to have an impact on lives, or is this just shifting?
Well, I think about this often. I do believe it is shifting. My evidence is anecdotal. I ask my students in 2 semesters of first-year writing now to choose a whole book, memoir in the first semester, and narrative nonfiction with research background in the second semester. And many of them report to me, this is the first whole book I've read in many years.
Wow.
And I think that when we look at, I feel it sometimes myself, the kind of entrancement in these little digital computers that are kind of attached to us. Our brains are very plastic. Nicholas Carr has written about this in his book, The Shallows, how we are literally changing our brains, young children. And he describes going on a technology diet and how he was very skittery until he could calm down enough to kind of focus on a book. So I think our attention spans are changing, and I think they are for young people. I don't think reading is going to go away, but I do think there is a change happening. Another person who I recommend is Sherry Turkle. She's a professor at MIT of psychology, psychoanalysis, and machines, computerized intelligent machines. And she has Alone Together, talking about that phenomenon of texting. And more recently, she has a book about reclaiming conversation. It's called The Power of Talk. Reclaiming conversation in a digital age. And literally that not only book reading, but face-to-face conversation where we look into each other's eyes is becoming challenging for younger people. So there is a big shift, I believe, happening. But the power of the book, still, students tell me when I'm able to slow down and it really grabs me, they are reading. So there's no wholesale, no despair, just awareness.
Yeah,
Awareness, sure.
I think that's true. There's a shift. There's not necessarily a complete loss. Kindle has certainly allowed students to walk around with books, and
Yeah,
I think many of them do.
Right.
And I also think they listen to story and narrative through podcasts and through Audible books. So I think those are perfectly legitimate ways to encounter literature.
Okay, we need to wrap this up. I mean, we could go on and on. Maybe we will go on and on. Well, I was thinking, because it's personal for me, what book haven't I read yet that I'm waiting for? I mean, what's the book that I wish somebody would write? I mean, I wish Stegner were writing another magnificent, absorbing novel. I mean, there are some out there.
Well, I want Toni Morrison to write another Beloved, although I don't think that's possible. But this is another one of the books that sort of opened my eyes in a bigger way to the entire experience of the whole issue of slavery and racism, and in a huge historical way, and yet there's a fantasy element in it, or a magical realism maybe, and that this is the kind of book I think we need. We need a new myth for our times.
That's a nice idea.
Yeah, I like it a lot.
No,
I want it to happen.
What about you, Bronwyn?
Well,
Is there
I
a
would
book you're waiting for?
Certainly, Beloved was on my list, and her The Bluest Eye.
Oh yeah.
So, I guess I would say it's not so much a book I'm waiting for, is a sense that there is so much out there that I want to reach towards. And certainly the sensibility of George Eliot and the way she wrote, it would be so interesting to take that kind of reflective sort of moral sensibility and bring it into the world that we're living in today. And I think there are some writers that are looking at that. I know, Anne-Marie, you've heard me talk about Richard Powers' magisterial book, The Overstory, which brings so much together. So I guess I don't have a specific book I'm waiting to be written so much as so many books, so little time. In terms of,
so there's still great books out there.
There are great
books. And it seems like nonfiction has come into its own.
Oh,
and
yes.
memoir
That's another element.
In a way that is relatively recent, and I celebrate that. I think that's because it used to be just fiction, and then a little bit of nonfiction over here was sort of a stepchild.
But nonfiction was always sort of journalistic and historical, and now nonfiction is very much the personal essay, the immersion story, and highly literary crafted sentences. I think that's something we can't overlook in terms of our.
I think a lot of that reflective sensibility has gone into some of the nonfiction.
Oh, absolutely.
But I also love to just be buried in a story.
I agree.
Isn't that wonderful to know at the end of the day there's that book waiting,
Yes.
and you can just leave your ordinary life for a little while and sink into another world that someone has created, hopefully with great confidence and brilliance. Nothing has replaced that.
And with the season, if we think of some of the PET scans that have been done of the reading brain, it is lit like a Christmas tree.
Yes,
Isn't
the,
that that's
the
great?
activity
I love that.
and the vibrancy is tremendous.
That's a great
And
image.
So many parts of our mind are engaged in a story where the imagination is truly enlivened and it's literal.
Yes.
It's like illuminated.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
Great image to wrap up on.
It is indeed.
Thank you for this conversation. This has
thank you
been
both.
so
It's
nourishing.
It's always so wonderful to talk
You're
books.
kind. It's a pleasure. I love it. Thank you for having me.
Great fun.
And we'll be right back.
Hello, and welcome back to our little wrap-up conversation on the topic of books that have changed us.
Books that have changed our lives. What? I mean, Bronwyn Jones is just like, she's so well read and she's so articulate, and her love of language is so evident. It's just an honor to have her
And
to
she always
talk
brings ideas to the table that would never have occurred to me. And I so value her
I
insights.
loved her story about the Diary of Anne Frank
Yes.
and that whole connection to history. That that is what books can do to us too. That I'd been thinking about more personal changes or writing related changes, but that was one that really brought to life a whole other thing that I hadn't been considering. So really, really big moment. It was a joy to talk with her. And then to end up with Toni Morrison and of course Powers, the Overstory, which is making the rounds right now, and apparently is an incredible read.
Speaking of a book that has been widely read recently is All the Light We Cannot See,
Yes,
which is a World War II. I mean, there's a great
Yes.
many quite remarkable books. Manhattan Beach, written about World War II, which seems an inexhaustible subject, but quite remarkable books that educate us, but also involve us in a really compelling story. So that's
and
still
make
happening.
us think beyond ourselves. I
Yes.
think that whole part about getting the brain really involved in that narrative drive is healthy, is good for us. I mean, our brains work, they light up, they become...
They open up. I mean,
Yeah,
think,
yes,
I
there
mean,
you go.
We some of the things we've talked about have opened our minds in the best sense, that we become more sensitive and maybe more tolerant and more compassionate about lives that are not like ours, but that we can participate in.
Right, right. And I just hope that reading, I know reading is evolving, it's changing, there's a shift, but I am so, as Bronwyn said, aware that it's not dying. It's just
Let us hope.
shifting. Yes, let us hope that it is not dying, but that people will still find value in picking up the page and the smell of books.
Underlining.
Yeah, marginalia, just having all that, those notes. I cherish those kinds of books, that were there.
And there are books on my shelf that I know I will never read again, but they're like friends. I can't get rid of them.
That's
I mean,
right.
they're there.
That's right.
There's some kind of nourishment just in their presence. That's important to me, and I want
think
that. I
that's
want
true.
everybody to have that experience.
Right, that they are like friends. Yes, I think that's really true.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I
It
feel
has
we
been.
could revisit this topic, and maybe we will. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for being with us.